executed by bloated civil servants and services that use incomplete data sets to make ad hoc judgments about policy issues and priorities. We think this is a problem that is easily solved by using current technologies that allow us to overcome these existing issues and to find solutions to the wicked problems that confront policymakers on a day-to-day basis. So we have 4 points of setup in this debate. First, what will these models actually look like? With regards to the data, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about surveys that are done to collect specific pieces of information about individuals that use the healthcare sector, for instance, or healthcare services. We're talking about censuses, which are broad-based surveys of the whole population regarding a number of issues relating to demography and identification of religion and those sorts of things. We're also talking about redacted information that is often depersonalized regarding things like your health data, regarding things such as recidivism or the rates of incarceration of particular groups. With regards to the analysis of this information, we're talking about often artificial intelligence that is required and used in order to assess and move through large amounts of information. We're talking about algorithms that are constructed to find certain pieces of information, to find correlations and associations and patterns in data, and that is essentially the priority. It is to sieve through a large amount of information and distill it into specific recommendations of pieces of information. What issues are we talking about specifically as a second point of setup? We're talking about most of what is mentioned on the info slide, whether it be issues of planning, issues of tackling longer term problems. It's not about backward looking sort of issues. We're talking about forward looking policy priorities. Thirdly, on the issue of privacy, we think there are a few reasons why this is unlikely to be a significant concern in this debate. The first is that there's a huge amount of data, which means largely it is deliberately anonymized and it's based on associations between different characteristics rather than Joe Blogs did this particular thing. It is always about the abstract features or characteristics of particular individuals. Secondly, this data is almost always already in the public domain. What we're discussing is the way in which that data is used by predictive algorithms to form certain assumptions or recommendations. Secondly, even if that breach occurs and there are some sort of leakages of data, that is unlikely to be anything that the NSA, for instance, doesn't already know with sweeping counterterrorism laws that exist in most countries. Even if that is not the case, we think that it is more important to prioritize the concerns of human security, which is to say the interest of individuals being safe and happy and having a high quality of life, and the specific abstract norm or principle of privacy in this instance, and I'll explain why in this speech. Final issue of setup, with regards to funding and research, we are likely to obviously rely on academic institutions and other individuals to provide these sorts of models, and we are more than willing to invest in those services in order to create the kind of models that can form these predictive algorithms and situations and methodologies. So, on a matter of weighing, what are we wanting to do in this debate? We're wanting to optimize public policy and rectify existing inefficiencies under the status quo. The reason we want to do this is these issues, and this is my first question of why we're improving public policy making in general. These issues are often what is known as wicked problems. This means they're problems that are incredibly complex and different to solve. No, thank you, but incredibly important. They're issues that have huge social consequences, whether it be the way in which housing policy can lock people out of access to homes, whether it be the way in which allocating funding in healthcare sectors can mean that one person dies of cancer while the other does not, the way in which criminal justice policy can strip you of your agency for a long period of time. In that context, why is predictive modeling a far better approach, and why is it something we should dramatically increase in the policymaking process? The first thing, the fact that it can analyze trends and form extrapolations, which means it's far more likely to be proactive to the degree that it is likely to understand the macro causal effects of certain phenomenon rather than being tied to the specific situations or experiences of a particular group at a particular point in time, which is one of the most fundamental cognitive biases that exist in human beings, which is a bias towards the present, a bias towards current experiences, rather than analyzing the broader trends across society that everyone else experiences. Secondly, it can quite frankly deal with a lot of data. It can do so comparatively far more than a civil servant who is looking at a computer. And apologies for any debaters who are civil servants or aspiring civil servants, but frankly, they're both largely incompetent and even if not incompetent, biased in a variety of different ways. And this is very, very different to an algorithm or to a machine such as an artificial intelligence kind of operation, which can assess huge amounts of data in a very efficient way without needing 9 to 5 working hours or coffee breaks 3 times a day. Third of all, it's impersonal, which is to say that these models do not have feelings and they do not have particular associations with different groups. And they may say, and after this I'll take up here why, well, these models can be biased in a few different ways. For instance, they may uncover that African Americans commit more crime in certain areas. A few responses. Firstly, these sort of issues are tied to the specific outcomes that are caused, which is to say that the reason biases may form in an AI is because certain patterns are observed, not that these social norms are ascribed onto a particular behavior, which means they're likely to remove a large chunk of pre-existing bias. For instance, that people think African Americans may be more aggressive, even if in many situations they don't commit the crime on the level people think. So we're saying it will actually be a lower level of bias than you'd expect. Secondly, even when that bias occurs, it's likely to firstly be related to long-term trends that will uncover the causes of these sorts of problems and show why society is often accountable, not the individuals. But even if that wasn't true, it's likely to mean that there won't be direct accountability or causality on that particular group.
4-6. What kind of realistic information do you expect from surveys that are going to help meaningfully with police deployment?
No, so the idea is that you can get information about the way you interact with these particular services. You might get and surveys is probably a bad example for that particular area of policymaking. So it'd be more relevant for healthcare services and understanding and optimizing how effective they are dealing with consumers. With regards to policing, it's probably looking at stuff like where are the highest rates of crime? How should we then allocate police officers in a way it's much likely to be far fairer and far more reflective of where crime actually is, rather than issues regarding, where do I think crime is most prominent? And that is the comparative in this debate as well. Neg may say, well, this could be biased or discriminatory in some way, but you have to compare that to the kind of individuals that run these departments generally, who are likely to have far stronger biases. The final point I make in this speech is it's likely to be far more efficient because these machines don't need upkeep, they don't need a wage, they're incredibly cheap. What it means is you're likely to save a huge amount of money in administering policies generally. That is money you can free up to spend on other social services, but it's also money that is going to be spent better in the sense you are unlikely to need to privatize those kind of services and you can have a better functioning bureaucracy, which Tutor will expand upon at Deputy. That is why I am proud to propose. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Connor. And thanks so much for sacrificing your time.
Thank you.
Okay. Now inviting the Leader of Opposition to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Hi everyone, I'll be talking about three themes today, and I will be integrating my rebuttal and my constructive. The first theme I'll be talking about is efficiency. The second one is accountability. And the third one is privacy and surveillance. So let's talk about efficiency first. It's true, we do have problems with data management and data hygiene in the status quo. That's absolutely correct. We have problems with data gathering. We have problems with data storage. Fair enough. But we argue on our side that these things can be improved without using the AI-driven models of the proposition side. What we want to do is use humans and computers, because we are also allowed to use computers and filing systems on our side. So we think that improvements can be made with data collection and data gathering processes. In fact, this is something they're also going to have to invest on in the other side, because if you don't have accurate data collection, which requires like human input and human investment, the kind of data you will be working on is unreliable and problematic anyway. So, the ease and efficiency benefit from their side is not as great as they want to talk about, but there are like precarious things that will ensue. So we would rather rely on humans using their computers rather than outsourcing our policies to AI. Now, the next two things. Let's talk about accountability in a bit. It's not as if in the status quo, we lack awareness of the imperfections of human judgment. The imperfections in human judgment is widely documented in the status quo. So it's not an issue of it being masked in any way in the status quo, right? In fact, we are sharply aware of racism in the criminal justice system or in the allocation of housing, for example. And in fact, we argue it is easier to spot it and track it when you are dealing with humans. It's also easier to hold humans accountable, because you can investigate their backgrounds, you can fire them, you can choose not to elect them next time, or you can retrain them. And it is a lot harder to do these things when you are dealing with machines or AI, because how exactly do you examine the biases inherent in AI systems, right? How can you tell if the algorithm is necessarily being objective or impersonal? Like, this is not an assumption we can make, especially if the speaker before me has conceded that it will be working with incomplete data in the first place, right? So if these systems and programs are fed problematic data, that is going to translate into flawed algorithms. And these incomplete data sets then are, well, harder to scrutinize because people are less able to when it comes to AI, rather than tracking individuals and their decisions and their isolated decisions. And these same biases will have self-fulfilling loops in their world too. So for example, if someone is coded by an AI program as an unreliable borrower, that person is unlikely to take out a loan, that person is unlikely to get a house, that person is unlikely to be able to send their kids to school. So these loops also exist in their world, right? And also, how are they going to get access to these informations? Are they, like, I don't know, lifting patents over information in their world? I mean, at least humans can be summoned and compelled to provide evidence and to explain their reasoning for their decisions in a more transparent way in our world. Now, before I continue, was there a point?
So Sharmila, you said that you're going to use both humans and computers, but to what extent then are you using predictive modeling or any kind of modeling at all? Like, are you using mathematical modeling, statistics? Is it just people using Excel spreadsheets? To what extent do computers play a role?
So we're not going to use machines that can generate decisions and models on their own without human intervention anymore. So the human intervention has to be significant on our side. So Excel is our friend, statistics are our friend, but we're not, employing thinking machines that essentially replace the presence of humans in this decision making. I mean, obviously Excel is important, both sides want it. Now, we will never, and broader point we're making here in terms of accountability is we're never going to understand AI and the flaws of AIs in the same way we can human agents. So during the US congressional hearings, for example, on Facebook and Google, these tech executives just ran circles around our legislators. So one question that Zuckerberg was asked, for example, was, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service? Which is quite funny, which shows the depth of their, lack of their ignorance of tech, right? So the CEO of Google was asked, why does searching for idiot return photos of Donald Trump? The CEO of Google was also asked why hateful information about a particular representative showed up on his 7-year-old's iPhone. What is he supposed to know about iPhones? He's a Google CEO. But the point I'm making here is, even our regulators and what more the general public are not going to understand AI, are not going to be able to scrutinize it in the same way we can a judge with a track record of, convicting people of color more harshly. Finally, on the point of privacy and surveillance that was, brushed aside by the first speaker, dismissed as a concern, we do think things get worse in our world, because in the status quo, people are still on guard about privacy violations, and we are still more willing to scrutinize the state and how the state uses data. Whereas in their world, we've essentially legitimized and normalized a regime where the state is able to surveil its population and gather data on every aspect of their lives. While it is true that the data exists in abstract form, the state is still able to build profiles of dissident groups and dissident activity, for example, or surveil activists. And even if they can't, the fact that everyone knows that the power of the state to do so has significantly increased, and all of these things are legal and above board and hard to challenge, even harder to challenge legally now, that has a chilling effect on how individuals behave. It also becomes a lot easier for states to engage in targeted political advertising based on their access to this data, to manipulate people's public opinions. And these risks cannot just be dismissed as things that already happen now, because they become the norm and they become harder to fight in propositions world. We are very happy to oppose.
Thanks, Shams. Okay, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Panel, it is amusing how Sharmila thinks, Excel will solve all of our problems because, famously you can apparently add up the same amount of information in an Excel, and that's fine if just, civil servants use one computer per person, that should, give you the data. But of course, the problem here is one of A, ability to go through the data physically, B, ability to centralize it, because if every civil servant uses one computer, sure, but you won't be able to track any kind of biases, across those many sort of civil servants and can't hold them accountable because each is using their own little Excel spreadsheet based on a tiny amount of data and reaching whatever conclusions they'd like to reach instead of a centralized one, right? So obviously the comparison is imperfect here, right? But in my speech today, 4 main points of rebuttal and then some more additions on what you've already heard from Connor. So first, in terms of rebuttal, I think the first thing we hear from Sharmila, well, one of the most impactful things, right, is that, you're going to code in biases as well, right? And this is a problem because you're constructing these mechanisms as well. Like, to some extent, fair enough. All of these AI systems will be based on sort of human construction. They're likely to inherit some problems, right? The comparative here is, sure, they might inherit some problems, but the comparative world is one in which humans already have all of these biases, those civil servants already have all of these biases, but those biases are multiplicated, right, in terms of their effects by the number of civil servants using them and using them differently, and more importantly, using them without knowing that the others are using those biases, right, and applying those same biases which Sharmila claims will enter these systems. The comparative of the algorithm on our side is that it can be criticized centrally, right? So you can specifically criticize and scrutinize a specific piece of reasoning and a specific piece of data to do with one system rather than having to go through every computer of every civil servant, right, or every decision-making process on a granular level, which you don't have the ability bureaucratically to do. But second of all, more importantly, sure, there are some initial inherited biases which the system has, but an AI and a machine learning-based system has the great advantage of being able to adapt to reality. So overcome those initial biases, because when it receives more and more data, it recognizes that those initial biases are actually not in line with reality, right? Not in line with the behavior of, Afro-American populations, which were initially deemed to be slightly more criminally inclined rather than the net population, right? The problem is, the important benefit here is that they can adapt to the reality, right? The third benefit in comparison is, again, an Excel spreadsheet is a very narrow snapshot of society which a civil servant uses, right? On the comparative, this bird's eye view that this algorithm has can take in far more data and use it to evolve beyond those biases, actually assess the entire society and trends which exist. I also want to point out on this point is, if they're going to criticize data for being bad, data is already used, right, but by civil servants as they claim, right? The problem is it's, as I've said, incomplete data based on snapshots and not holistic. The last problem I'll point out here is that because this data is already in use, it actually, without a centralized algorithms, disparate sets of data allow conclusion shopping by politicians, right? So essentially, it's civil servants or politicians who have a goal in mind, a desired outcome or hypothesis, right, which they think will please their electorate, and they will then seek out data which fits that specific theory or policy, right? They will find data because there's such an enormous amount of sort of data out there. But the problem is, because and they'll be able to present that data as being compelling scientific evidence for why you should adopt this actually bad policy. When you have a centralized AI system, right, you can't do that anymore, right? Because any sort of such theory which you're trying to conclusion shop, right, will be debunked by your AI, which actually corroborates data together. Now, second point of rebuttal, I think Sharmila tells us, but humans can get better. You can retrain and fire people, right? and you can't change this AI. This is absolutely false, right? You can easily tweak this algorithm to adapt if it needs to be done, right? Even more so, I want to point out that tweaking the algorithm is far better because the debate and scrutiny about what the algorithm should be doing will be science-led. It'll be led by the scientific community poring over the data and data sets within these AIs, specifically because, as Sharmila says, politicians don't understand it, right? So crucially, it'll be data scientists which look at how the reasoning was done, so the debate will be driven by scientists, right? That means that you can get far better tweaks rather than firing bits of the civil service. I want to also point out that they can be tweaked, that these tweaks can be done far easier than firing entire swathes of a bureaucratic system which will leave you dysfunctional as a country for a long time, and additionally, which you'll be able to replace completely. Now, third point of rebuttal. Crucially, Sharmila says, we're aware of these problems, right? We know that there's problems with the criminal justice system. Yeah, but the problem is you have no clear proof by accruing data to use these known problems, right, to prove that you have to adopt policies. So, for example, by implementing this AI, you will see clear accrued data that, for example, increasing jail terms does not create deterrence, right? Or increasing jail terms does not reduce recidivism, rather hampers rehabilitation. The problem is, indeed, in debate circles, we know this, but the problem in reality is there are studies, right, from criminology institutes which show these things that, for example, large jail terms don't work. But the problem is they're disparate studies. They are studies which are dismissed as anecdotal by politicians and say, it's not centrally accrued, we don't know for sure. Some scientists say this, some scientists say that. And crucially, what this allows is one of the largest problems of politics. No thanks. In politics right now, one of the largest problems is a false equivalence, right? The notion in politics, that there is a debate about anything, right? There's both sides to, whether we should use huge jail terms, right? And which allows politicians to dither and to choose either, option which is politically palatable to their supporters. This will not be possible when you have absolutely compelling, overwhelming data on this particular side accrued by this AI, right? Lastly, I just want to point out that I think you've heard no response on how actually you're going to focus on far more structural issues, such as, what exactly within the Afro-American community is deprivileged in terms of lack of education, right? Or lack of sort of job opportunities, which creates, in many instances, right, perceived spikes in criminality, right? Which allows you to deal with the larger problems initially, right? But lastly, I just want to point out that a lot of this will be able to debunk fake science. Tanner told you about how these AIs can be proactive rather than reactive, right? And they can act to prevent things before they happen, which means acting far faster. In the coronavirus, right, outbreak, right, the writing was on the wall since January, right? Previous pandemics were able to predict these problems. Governments did not act and acted very late, right, because they had to play catch up because they did not act. And lastly, as I was saying, it debunks fake science. Politicians won't be able to say, let's just use herd immunity, guys. That'll work, right? Because the AI debunks it altogether. Because of all these reasons, please propose.
Thank you, Tudor. And now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, here.
Data is sexist, privileged, and racist. Human beings have the ability to recognize that. AI does not. Three things in this debate. First, why is it that the AI is likely to make wrong predictions based on its data as opposed to human beings? Second, who is more accountable? And third, on the issue of moral calculations, why we do not trust the AI. So first, why is the AI likely to make wrong predictions? Two reasons. First, because the data is skewed. As we have already told you, that the information that has historically existed is obviously skewed. For example, if you look at the criminal justice system, it's extraordinarily racist. What does this mean? It's not as if what OG has said, which is that the AI is just going to take on some of the biases. No, it is the opposite, which is that it is going to take on this bias and emphasize on this bias and exacerbate the worst harms of human biases because humans can at least recognize and correct for some of these biases, whereas AI does not. A couple of examples here. One, for example, when it comes to police deployment, it looks at poor neighborhoods as generally being those of having higher crimes. It ends up allocating more police officers there, which inevitably results to more arrests, i.e. creating a feedback loop where it pats itself on the back for making the correct decision and doubling down on the decision as it develops. A second example could be, for example, looking at detection of cancer. Privileged areas are more likely to have higher detection rates because people who are richer go to hospitals more often, get these medical checkups. Often this means that it's going to allocate funding for cancer, for example, towards already pre-existing privileged areas. These are errors in data that human beings, through sheer common sense, can correct for just by looking at it and realizing, obviously, infection rates in richer areas are higher because of the fact that richer people get tested more. But this is information that might be common sense to us, but an AI does not have the capability to recognize and correct for, which means it creates a feedback loop, which makes the situation significantly worse and exacerbates the worst harms of the skewed data and worst harms of the human bias, which is why we think it makes it significantly worse. The second reason why AI is likely to make wrong predictions is because data often does not give context of today. So decisions have to be made in keeping in mind current context. Often historical data is devoid of this context. So for example, policing deployment decisions are after the Michael Brown issue, for example, should be inherently different to what would have been if you just focused on historical data. Another situation would be, for example, making policies about housing development in often recently racially politicized areas, such as in Rwanda, or even whereas in the aftermath of Hindu-Muslim riots in Bangladesh or India. These are context-based decisions that often have to be taken. The data simply does not provide the context for, which is why it makes these wrong decisions. I think here, the only logic OG has provided is that they're likely to be proactive because it can look at data and take decisions beforehand. And literally the only example was the coronavirus pandemic. What data is going to be there for it to talk about? Like, is it going to look at the Spanish flu from back in the day and talk about, like, yeah, that might happen in today's context? These are absolutely missing data that no kind of proactive decision-making can be made by the AI in the first place. So firstly, I think on that, OG already falls because they are making wrong predictions because the data they're feeding to it, something that humans can easily check for through sheer common sense. Second, in terms of accountability, who is more accountable? Is it humans or is it the AI? We would say the AI is not accountable for, let's say, 3 reasons. First, because the information that you need to scrutinize. I know OG used the word granularity a lot of times to talk about accountability, but I don't think that really explains how this works, right? So when you're talking about a private company that owns the process through which this decision is made, so public don't have access. Why is this? So for example, when the company Compass has the information on how police deployment occurs, it is not publicly available because that is property of that company. If it is publicly released, it means rivals have an edge over it, right? So rivals can copy it, which is, it is the intellectual property. So people don't even have access to the information to be able to scrutinize the processes through which AI makes its decision. But second, let's assume somehow you have the ability to make this information public. Even then, this is extraordinarily difficult to actually scrutinize. Why? Because the way AI makes I got cut.
You're back.
Okay. So where did you hear me last?
Even if it is public, it is extraordinarily difficult to scrutinize.
Okay,
at 452. Yep.
Okay. The reason it is difficult is because AIs make these decisions very differently from how human beings make it. A single decision, simple decision by an AI, if you ask for the explanation, it would be a 400 to 500 page book of different algorithms run through the system that a human being, even the owners of the AI, would not be able to understand and explain. as opposed to human beings, where one or two overriding considerations usually are the reasons why people make decisions, which are far easier to be held accountable. So you wouldn't even know how these processes are made to be able to hold them accountable. The third reason why AI is incredibly difficult to hold accountable is, as OG suggested, the average human being is very different from debaters, right? Which essentially means that there's a veneer of scientific validity to the system, which means people are unlikely to want to question how this AI works in the first place. So we don't even know how the scrutinization or the mobilization would occur for the scrutiny to happen. Sure.
So which one is it? Is this AI does it take into account so many factors that it's so complex that it cannot be scrutinized, or does it not take into account historical context at all, the specific instances of individuals, which allows it to focus on larger trends and structural issues such as poverty or unemployment rather than criminality?
Both. It takes into account lots of different considerations based on the data available to them. Sometimes the data is missing, which is problematic. Based on the data that is given to them, it takes into consideration huge swaths of information from the data set, which itself might be problematic, but then again, you can't also scrutinize because of how it works. As opposed to human beings, there's at least some forms of accountability that can happen. Firstly, a lot of bad decision-making by AI will be made based on the fact that humans would not have a reason to be biased in the first place. But secondly, there are some ways in which people can be held accountable. Politicians can be bought by companies, but also through the vote can be held accountable. Judges can go through votes, but can also be shamed based on the record, on the pattern of decisions they have made. These are decision-making processes. That means that there are processes through which human beings can be held accountable in a way that AI can never be. And that's why it's fundamentally problematic, we oppose.
Oh, thank you, Mubarak. Okay, and now I invite the member of government, Shehya.
Just 1 second, sorry. Opening opposition tells you that what they want to do is meld the best of both worlds, have both machine learning, or at least some level of statistics and Excel spreadsheets, and also the innate capacity of humans to recognize sexism, racism, and privilege wherever they go. I think that their problem is that they don't acknowledge that the vast majority of individuals who actually engage in statistical analysis couldn't tell you mathematically what the difference between an ANOVA and a t-test, what the difference between a student and a paired one is. And I think that problem, the refusal of human beings to understand their own unique myopic view of events, is their downfall. We say that statistics is a poor way of understanding when you don't have a big picture approach to it. One thing that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be specifically talking about why is it that policy making is massively improved at the point in which you have big data. We have 3 reasons for that we think are clearly distinct from OG, but I think that the main thing that we're going to add is we're going to very directly compare to the alternative that's provided by opening opposition. Before that, though, I do have 2 points of response that I'd like to delve in. Firstly, on the awareness of bias, and secondly, on their inability to understand machine learning and artificial intelligence. Firstly, on the awareness of bias, because what Shamila and then Mubarak also tell us is that it's easier to spot and track humans because you have the capacity to hold them accountable, because human beings have an ability to explain things that have gone wrong in their thought process. Overall, I think that there's 3 reasons why that's wrong. The first, and why we actually think that it's the opposite, that bias is actually easier to identify and track when you have big data models. The first one is that it's actually, counter to what they say, way easier to spot. Because at the end of the day, if you have a human resources executive at a company that hires 4 men and 1 woman, it's very easy for the company to just be like, you know what, that's fine. Out of those 5 candidates that we had positions for, maybe the men were just more qualified. It becomes infinitely more difficult to justify when an algorithm is telling you that what you should hire is 90 men and 10 women. And it is at that point where the sheer size of data sets that force you to realize the number of individuals that you're then hiring is that then it becomes more statistically, but also obviously significant. It is looking at things closely, which is what human beings do because we don't have the capacity to take in as much data that allows us to better understand our biases. No, thank you. The second thing that we tell you is that also human beings have the capacity to explain. And unlike what OO says, that's actually a really bad thing. Because we don't think that individuals have the capacity to see racism wherever they go. We think that judges that convict rapists to 6 months of community service don't do it because they think that women are worth less and they were just looking for it. They do it because they genuinely believe that that is the right thing. They believe that that young man standing in front of them didn't really mean it, or he was just drunk, or he just didn't understand and misunderstood circumstances. And that is, in many cases, because of sexist bias. And I think that human beings just overall have an inability to admit when that happens. That is because we don't like to think of ourselves as bad people, so we're considerably less likely to admit to ingrained racism, ingrained sexism, ingrained homophobia. I think that overall, an algorithm just turns out data that its models were meant to give out. And that means that overall, when we find something suspicious about it, it kind of gives us excuses about why is it that Black men behave more aggressively in court and therefore get convicted more. We are forced to look at the models. And if the model is strange, if it says that women are less capable, if it says that Black people are more aggressive, then we're much more likely to look at the ingrained biases of it. We think that overall, when you have academics scrutinizing it, when it is in the nature of science to look at things such as why did you get the results that you got, it is much more important and much easier to do so than with policy decisions with humans who are used to giving excuses. The last thing that I want to talk about here is that also, humans don't actually realize when they lack data because we're kind of myopic in view. It is why, for example, most of us probably know that we know how to pump someone's heart when we think that they've had a heart attack, but we actually don't, because if you did that to a woman, then you'd probably crack her ribs. It's just that you don't realize that most of the times you see just men being done that to them on medical TV shows because they're trying to avoid showing women's breasts on TV. We don't realize that we lack a big picture approach until we basically have to input the data onto an algorithm and we realize, oh, I only have men. Why is it that I only have men? Overall, it's easier to see data when you're inputting data sets. We think that that myopic is wrong. The last thing I want to talk about is the other argument that they gave us, this whole thing about the inability to understand and how in congressional hearings, individuals tell us about individuals were unable to understand how is it that Facebook makes money or how Google search algorithms want. Maybe old white Republicans were unable to understand it, but I wager that most people in this room could probably explain it in under 30 seconds, as would most 11-year-olds that also have a Facebook. I wager then that this means that it's not that humans are unable to understand, but rather that individuals need to be replaced. We reckon that in our world, we get more tech-savvy people in Congress. They also can't have it both ways. They can't have people who simultaneously exploit this to brainwash in the campaign trail and also are incapable of understanding. Before I move on, does anyone have a POI? No?
Assume huge data sets are exclusive to the government bench.
Well, I think that first of all, the capacity of Excel to actually manage big data is quite smaller, but also, and here's the really big thing, right, is that when a code is broken, a machine or an algorithm is able to fix it, whereas if you have 10,000 data points and one of them is kind of weird, you just do not have, as a person, enough will to look through every single one of them and find the one that meant that your statistical analysis yielded the result that it got. For those kinds of analysis, you do need something slightly bigger than yourself. You do need technology. So then onto my next argument, onto my actual sort of argumentative extension, right? And that's the idea that policy making, directly comparing with OO and their Excel spreadsheets, is just much better. 3 broad reasons for this. Firstly, we do have the capacity to analyze trends in a much better way, mostly because of the things that I already just mentioned, right? That just the capacity of individuals to go through the thousands and thousands and thousands of data points that is required for statistical analysis that is significant and identify errors or statistical variances is just considerably limited. When you have to go through thousands of lines of code in order to identify the one that yielded a statistical missense, then I think that that's something that machines are much better able to identify than humans. Secondly, because of what I mentioned, it's not just that machines are impersonal, as OG tells you, but rather that human beings are capable of making excuses, that we like to think of ourselves as good people, and therefore we're really unlikely to accept errors in judgment. And the last thing that I want to talk about is also the fact that people just don't understand statistics. We like to use them because they make us feel safe, but at the end of the day, we're not as capable of understanding as we are understanding machine learning. At the end of the day, I just think that we're much less able to identify issues when it comes packaged in the myopia of humans than when it comes on the raw facts of machines, both close and government.
Thanks, Lucia. Can I now invite the member of opposition, here?
Testing. This is not a debate about whether big data is intrinsically good or bad. It is a debate about whether it is good or bad, specifically in the context of policymaking by the state. Consequently, two lines of extension. Firstly, why this policy undermines democratic transparency and accountability. Second, why it undermines our ability to regulate the developmental trajectory of big data. Before that, a few points of rebuttal against CG. The first claim we get from CG is that humans can give reasons for their judgments, but sometimes those are bad reasons. For example, if a prosecutor or a judge thinks that women are just less capable. That is true, but note here that when people give bad reasons, critically, we can rebut those bad reasons and suggest reasons why we disagree. That is the premise of public debate, and that is the premise of good, healthy democracy. The difference is, given that AI can't give reasons for its actions, as we'll explain later on, we think that that crucial move of being able to respond to bad reasons can't even occur in the first place. Second, we're told that humans don't realize when they don't have enough data, and that the volume of data is sometimes just too small. We'll respond to this in extension. Third, we're told we just need more tech-savvy people in Congress to regulate the stuff. The problem is that it's quite rare to get very tech-savvy people in Congress, noting that there is often data scientists have a very different profile to the profile of a politician. Data scientists like to hedge their statements. They like to tell you when it is legitimate to draw an inference from the data, whereas politicians like to use sort of reductive sound bites in order to promote particular policies. Consequently, we just don't think they're a good fit or are likely to get elected to Congress. Finally, we're told people don't understand statistics. That is true, but data scientists understand statistics. Notably, both people and data scientists understand big data less than they understand statistics. Okay, first point of extension. Why does this undermine democratic transparency? 3 reasons. Reason number 1, garbage in, garbage out. AI operates by extracting patterns from existing data sets. The problem is the data set that you use to train your model is sometimes a bad data set. For example, given that in the US, there is a large amount of over-policing of the African-American community, it's very likely we pick up a large amount of crime from this community just because of the racist way in which police activity is conducted. Consequently, when you train your data to spot patterns, your model to spot patterns in the data, you're likely to assume, as the computer model doesn't know that this data set is incomplete, that there is just more crime amongst the African-American community, even if that is not generally true. The consequence of this is that you end up having a model that predicts that these are people who are more likely to commit crime or more likely to reoffend. Note the difference between this and a scenario in which a human is making a judgment. We know that humans make biased judgments and have prejudices in the way they produce judgment. The problem is that artificial intelligence and big data carries with it a veneer of objectivity because we think it is making fair judgments, even though the data set on which it is based is not fair. The second problem is the problem of overfitting. This responds to the closing government extension. Note here, merely throwing more data at a model does not necessarily make that model more accurate. Any data scientist will tell you there is a big problem with overfitting of a model. To illustrate this problem, most of us learn in science class to draw lines of best fit through complicated mazes of dots on a diagram. The problem is, how closely should your line fit those dots? You could draw, in principle, a line which connects all of the dots, but that will not give you any meaningful trend out of the data because your model isn't capturing the trend. Your model is capturing the errors in the data. The problem is we don't know when our model is underfitting the data or overfitting the data, which means that it does not have the predictive power that this government bench thinks it has. The third problem is the problem of the black box, or the unexplainability problem. And I think this also responds to CG's material. It is not just politicians who don't understand big data and the models that they use to predict facts. Data scientists themselves also often don't understand the reasons why certain predictions are made. How do machines, how does machine learning or artificial neural networks, how do they operate? They operate by extracting patterns from data and learning to make accurate predictions. So for example, what you do is you initialize a bunch of weights and biases, you make a prediction based on those weights and biases, you look at how well the prediction fits the data, then you go back and you tweak your weights and biases, you make the prediction again until your prediction becomes more accurate. The problem is, at no point are you giving a reason why you're making certain predictions. The way that the machine makes a prediction is an initialization pattern flows through a bunch of activation sequences in your neural network, and then you decide that, then you produce a prediction at the end of it without giving you a reason why that was the prediction that you made. In contrast, humans can give reasons. So to give you an example of this, no thank you. If I am denied a mortgage, for example, because I have a poor credit score, I can ask, why was my credit score so poor? And the person can tell me, that's because you made a particular purchase at a certain point, or you defaulted on a loan at a certain point in history. The AI can't tell you that. All it does is it scans your profile, a series of weights and biases activate in the network, and it says, do not give this person a mortgage, without giving you any reasons why that is true. Why does this matter? Because the premise of democracy is that we deliberate upon problems through the use of publicly accessible reason. We think this is the basis on which democratic governments gain legitimacy. Note that governments wield tremendous power over our lives. They are licensed to use violence to take property, to limit our individual freedom. That use of violence is only legitimate if we can understand the reasons for which policies are taken and argue against them if need be. A couple of nuances here. One, we think that we're happy for AI to be used in the private sector. We just think there's a special obligation for governments specifically to be accountable in the way they deploy their policy. And second, we think that given that political apathy is at an all-time high, it's going to get even worse if the average person thinks that they can't understand, they can't participate in democracy because there's just no way they could understand like the complexity of the machinery that is involved. This will exacerbate those political problems. That is a bad thing. Any POI from closing?
Yeah,
nope.
So
yeah.
This seems symmetric unless you can prove to me that humans do have perfect knowledge of what would be good data.
That's not true. We think like humans don't have perfect knowledge, but they can give reasons for why they do things, and we can protest those reasons if we disagree with them. With a machine, you are literally just outsourcing the decision making to it without any ability to hold that. We think that what makes big data good or bad is how well we can regulate its developmental trajectory. Governments are not perfect at this, but they are the only viable regulators. This policy undermines this. One, because now governments are purchasing and deploying big data to be used. Regulations often drive up the costs of using these technologies, which means they are incentivized to not implement regulation which is as harsh. Secondly, when there are problems with the way that these models operate, there's a strong incentive on governments to cover up these sorts of scandals, because instead of checking the corporations that deploy these models, you now have every incentive to prevent your own government experiencing scandal by being accused of a data leakage. This is very bad. This means that big data doesn't get regulated. That means all the harms of privacy and data vulnerability are exacerbated. Consequently, what matters in this debate is not whether data is good or bad objectively, but whether it is good or bad as used by governments. And those are reasons why you should oppose.
Okay, thank you, Darian. And now call upon the government whip here.
Okay, 1 second. Let me get a timer. Okay, I'm going to summarize this debate by going through the teams in increasing order of relevance to the debate. So firstly, OG, who have no arguments. Secondly, CO, who have no extension. And lastly, OO, who have no meaningful stance. Okay, so first thing, open in government. They have a series of issues in that they lack most of the mechanisms that we gave you in our extension. That is to say, we explained things like why going through more data is likely to lead you to better conclusions, because you can test more hypotheses, you can compare different things. Just simply knowing more things about the world means we have a better understanding of in what ways we might want to change the world and in what ways those changes are likely to better the world. Secondly, we're able to explain that we are able to uncover trends in ways which we might never be able to do in opposition's work. That is because sometimes we don't have a good understanding of why two disparate issues might be linked. What big data is able to do is to tell us that these two entirely unrelated things, indeed many of the things that opposition complained about, so things like the effect of, for example, wealth and poverty on crime rates, big data can take these two separate sets of information, combine them, spit out a graph and says, hey, these two things seem correlated, you should care about them. That's a benefit that we gave you in CG that wasn't present in OG. And lastly, in terms of the understanding of issues, this is also incredibly important because computers, crucially, don't actually need to understand what any of the numbers mean. All they need to know is that this number goes up or this number goes down when it is prodded by this other number in this way or this way. And it's very easy then for us to make lots of different models and reach lots of different conclusions that we would otherwise be unable to do. Next, closing opposition. So I'll try and deal with all the stuff that was new first of all. So they said, look, we can't rebut AI, but we can rebut bad reasons politicians give us. I just think this argument is relatively symmetric because firstly, it assumes that we get a similar level of decision justification on both sides. In many cases, politicians just like, we did the policy, why? Because we did some stats that said it was good. And I don't think the stats are any easier to understand than a spit out from some algorithm. The only response to this we get is, but data scientists do understand statistics from closing opposition. Now, if this is true, I feel like this undermines some of the things opening opposition said about how no one can understand any of this data ever. But if data scientists can understand statistics in Excel, I don't understand why it's that much difficult when it's in MATLAB or R. For example, the only real extension here is the idea that AI is uniquely difficult to understand for some reason that they didn't really explain. It might be because closing opposition don't understand how AI works. And indeed, a running theme on the opposition bench is to explain a bunch of really bad ways to set up AI and then complain that the conclusions that AI might draw would also be bad. Indeed, I suspect it would, and that's why people would not set up those models in those ways. They tell us that politicians aren't particularly tech savvy. I mean, sure, so they're bad at statistics, they're bad at AI, etc. That's why Boris Johnson doesn't himself set all of these policies. He gets advised by a huge bureau of scientists and civil servants who would be able to understand these models and therefore would be able to draw meaningful conclusions. Next, they tell us about input problems. I'll talk about this in a second, but the short answer is that input problem is at best symmetric, but also we make it better. Next, they say justifications. Again, I just don't think this is true. I think the AI could say, no, I'm not telling you a reason why I'm not giving you a loan, much in the same way that any loan provider could. Or we could say, press the button on the AI that says, give a reason, and the AI will say, well, your score on this particular index was too low. Your score on this index was too high. And it can very easily, with a few extra lines of code, give a short printout for the justification for which parameters you were too high or too low on. And it would take all of 5 seconds to, write a little plugin to spit it out in Microsoft Word to explain it to someone. And I think a lot of the responses to the democratic accountability stuff are also similar for these reasons. I think that very easily different political parties or different non-governmental organizations could create different models and say, look, here, our model gets a different result if we change these input parameters. Justify why you're using this model. Indeed, this is something we've seen a lot, in particular with regards to the coronavirus pandemic and how people have changed their predictions and changed their policy platforms on the basis of different data being called out by other people. And the last stuff about private-public, I think the distinction is artificial. Lots of examples they used about denying people mortgages are also true of private organizations, which also have large amounts of control over our lives. So the distinction seems super arbitrary. Anyway, let's talk about OO and the bits of CO, therefore, that were derivative. The first problem is that their overall stance is incredibly unclear because they seem to only want to talk about using AI and only want to talk about AI being the final decision maker. That's not the case, and that's not the stance of any team on government. The AI will spit us out a bunch of data, a bunch of graphs, and it will still have that basic sense checking of a human being signing that into law or deciding whether this policy actually happens, which means in the worst cases of opera, the AI says, hey guys, the best way to control poverty would be kill all the poor people. example, it's not like we just have an automatic button from the AI going into policy making. Obviously, a human being is going to sense check this at some point. In terms of the awareness issue of data, I also think this is flawed. I think people don't necessarily know that they are racist. They believe what they're doing is sensible. I think it's asserted that people have the common sense to know that they are being racist and that we can change this in a meaningful way. It's also asserted that people have the common sense to know that they're missing important bits of data. Indeed, that only works if I know that I should be expecting more data, which is a primary benefit of AI, which is able to tell us what data we can correlate and what things we can work out without even knowing what those things mean or why they work together. I'll take opening if they're still around.
Yeah. The CG's case has entirely been about why having information is good. This, like, it is not at all exclusive. Opposition can use those models as well. The only difference is you have to support them replacing human judgments as prescribed to you by the motion.
I mean, the motion says that we want to use more data and less arbitrary human judgment. We still support some human judgments, but we'd prefer that those human judgments were informed by more and better big data gathering. The next response to a lot of OO stuff is a lot of their stuff about bad modeling also falls slowly away from the debate. As we use these models more, we have incentives to collect more data, to collect better data. And crucially, it's way easier to spot when there are problems with this data. Firstly, because with big data sets, small trends become more statistically significant. A 0.5% deviation from what we expect is easier and able to be proven to be true if I have a million pieces of data as opposed to just 10. I remember all of the data. I'm able to manipulate and compare different data sources. It's easier to correct because I can review my code, compare it to other models, and multiple organizations are likely to do this. And so I think the last set of things they tell us about bad modeling are basically just reasons why people might make bad models. They might have poor sense checking. They might have no ability to understand that data is problematic. But all of these things are also true of any set of statistics we want to use in the status quo, but they lack the corrective mechanisms that Lucia gave you to explain why this gets better in the long run. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Okay, I thank the government whip and call upon the opposition whip here.
Thank you all for staying. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Yeah? Yes? Oh, okay, cool. I'm going to do two things in the speech. First, I'm going to respond to the main mechanisms on the Gov bench, which, to be fair, did only come out in the CG. And second of all, I'm going to tell you why we take the opposition bench, because we prove to you that accountability increases on our side of the house. The first big problem with the Gov bench is the POI that OO gave, which is the motion says you would significantly replace human judgments, the emphasis there being significant. Now, I'm not sure exactly what it means. I would hazard it's somewhere in the region of 80 to 90%, and maybe CG gets away with saying that in the remaining 10% of cases, we will have a president, say Trump, hypothetically sign off on these things before they become law. The problem is that the one useful contribution the opening government gave is framing this as a case of wicked problems, where literally any misplaced decision would have a catastrophic impact on someone's life. So I just think net in 10% of cases, you would have a human being doing a sense check on the Gov side, and in 90% of cases, we would likely do a terrible thing to someone's life. There are three other things that closing governments say. The first is that it is easier to spot bias. For example, you can test a hypothesis about the gender divide if we see 4 men employed for every 1 woman. There is a vicious circle here that they do not get out of. Because in order to make an unbiased decision going forward, in other words, to extract bias from a pattern that you've seen, you need to already know what that bias is. So you cannot at the same time use a model that says we will use this information to spot instances of bias, while at the same time using knowledge earlier on of that bias to try and ensure that biased decisions are taken out there. So as an illustration of this, the model can't simultaneously detect bias by saying, well, there are 4 men to 1 woman, so there is some gendered hiring going on here, and at the same time be able to distance themselves from a conclusion that says women are just less likely to want to be in the workplace from an extrapolation of that same data. In other words, this part of the CG case just doesn't work with the rest of the stuff they've talked about. The next thing they say is that all we need to know is that numbers, when prodded, move in a certain direction. Not true. We unfortunately need to know a bit more than that. We need to know why the numbers move in a certain direction. Otherwise, the prodding, if done in the future, won't work. And that's where the stuff we tell you about not being able to have understanding of those reasons, no thank you, means that we just don't really get that. So yeah, just because something's happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to happen again in the future. Finally, CGs say that human beings are just kind of bad people, and they make excuses and they refuse to acknowledge that they've been biased in the past. Yeah, we're probably okay with that. There are a few things here that matter, though. The first is that usually the researchers and scientists, social scientists or otherwise, or even government think tanks who are trying to eliminate bias, they aren't the accused, so they don't feel like they have a stake in not calling things out. They're quite happy to do so. Second of all, it's much more likely that we can convince people they've been unconsciously biased when we can walk them through it, when we can show them 10, 12, 15 data sets which all say the same thing, because that's an illusion of having many confirming sources, as opposed to a button which just spits out a single conclusion in a way that a human being is not likely to understand it. So I think what this means is you're either going to have a mix of biased and unbiased decision making, and a mix of valid and invalid conclusions about the state of the world, but all of this trapped under the destructive veneer of thinking that the science and the data is getting it right. That is a world in which apathy comes about. That is a world in which there's less accountability for the reasons that we will now talk about.
POI?
No, thank you. So Darian tells you that democratic accountability is going to be destroyed for a number of reasons. What are CG's responses to this? The first response is to say that with a few lines of code, the big data can also give a reason as to why you were, for example, rejected for a loan. Let me get this straight. With a few lines of code, they think that they're going to be able to capture all those benefits that their GovBench is entirely about, all those numbers floating around in some weird computer space thing. And in a few lines of code, they're going to be able to design a plugin that works. I mean, those can be ridiculously messy and long lines of code, if that's even going to be possible. The better response they give is that this is symmetric, because it's actually objectively pretty hard to question government decisions. So I'm going to make that comparison very clear. When you're trying to apply for an immigration visa in a country, say this one, there is in the status quo a rubric that's based on things like whether you have a job and whether you speak the language. And presumably, the reason we weight some points in a points-based immigration system the way it is because we have some information done traditionally through statistical methods like Excel as to which ones make you more likely to succeed as an immigrant or make you more likely to contribute to the economy. Now, is that fair, and is that the best way of doing things? We're not sure. But at least you as an immigrant have the ability to question that in the future, or groups are able to point to existing research and say, hey, maybe this factor is overvalued, this factor is undervalued. This goes for literally any government decision that is rubric-based. Who's that from? Hello? Is that POI?
Sorry, OG, yep.
Nah, it's fine. You had nothing to debate anyway. So any rubric-based system is one that someone else can interrogate because the rubric exists. Yeah, go ahead.
So surely the AI will just publish the rubric that it uses to assign these things and the indices it gave you for the various factors it cares about.
You see, if you're getting to the point where an easily understandable rubric, an applicable rubric is going to be produced, you're actually much more like what the op bench cares about now, i.e. you're putting huge constraints on how you're using the data and the fact that it must be intelligible to a human being, whereas a lot of your case is about taking out the flaws of human beings for all their flawed humanness. Finally, they say, but companies do the same evil things too. And you know what? We don't really like that, which is why one of our parts of our case is that governments should clamp down on companies who do stupid shit, and there was no response to that. That is criminal from closing government, and because they haven't responded to that, not only do they not have a chance, because they've also wasted their POI, they should lose to us on that. Because Darren tells you why regulation is impossible. It's impossible because anything which hurts the big data industry is likely to hurt a government's ability to deliver on its political promises, assuming that it does even help them deliver in the first place. This is important because governments are arguably the only force large enough to combat abusive technology on a large scale. In other words, it is unique. But going back to the original discussion about accountability, the reason the private sector is different is because governments have a special obligation to people. The special obligation lies in the fact that they're coercing them to live in a state or in any state at all. And by virtue of that coercion and that tyranny, they have an obligation to do some very basic things, like make sure that they have housing and make sure that they have healthcare. And at the point where you're out of order, the point where you're denied that healthcare, denied that housing for no intelligible reason, that's unaccountability in its worst form. That's a world in which you are completely unable to hold your politicians to account, to challenge the reasons why you've been discriminated against, or to challenge your place within that society. That is a society that isn't fair and it isn't accountable, and it's definitely not democratic. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to stand in closing opposition.